The Whispers of Hollowbrook, Chapter 1. The Invitation. The rain had been falling for days, an endless sheet of grey that covered the sky and dripped down like a slow, quiet torment. Hollowbrook was the kind of town that seemed forgotten by the IC world. Nestled in the woods at the edge of nowhere, the people who lived there were recluses, strange and distant from the larger world. Some even whispered that the town wasn't fully alive, as though it had been lost to time. It was on a dreary evening in late October that Ethan Carter received the letter. It was an old-fashioned thing, written on thick parchment, the edges torn as though it had been handled by many hands over many years. His name, Ethan Carter, was scrawled in elegant faded ink on the front, and the handwriting seemed almost ancient. The contents were simple, but chilling. Dear Mr. Carter, we have not forgotten you. Come home to Hollowbrook. Your presence is required. The house calls. Yours sincerely, the Hollowbrook residence. He'd never heard of the place, never been there, yet somehow the letter filled him with a strange, impossible nostalgia. He tried to shake it off, thinking it was just some prank from an old friend, but the message lingered in his mind, gnawing at him. Something about it felt real, desperate, and, most unsettling of all, it felt familiar. There was a pull in the back of his mind, a compulsion that could not be ignored. Ethan found himself packing his bags that very night, his hand trembling as he pulled his worn leather jacket over his shoulders. The letter was still there, sitting on his desk, the weight of it pressing into his thoughts as he decided that perhaps he should go to Hollowbrook. After all, who could resist answering a call from the past? Chapter 2. The journey to Hollowbrook. The drive took longer than he expected. The town was hidden in the forest, nestled far off the main roads, where the trees loomed like silent sentinels. The air grew thick with mist as he traveled deeper into the woods. Ethan's car crept along a narrow, twisting road that was more a trail than a proper highway, his headlights barely cutting through the fog that seemed to settle in and never leave. As the minutes ticked by, the atmosphere grew heavier. A strange sense of being watched crept over him. His eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone, something, lurking in the shadows of the mist. But every time he looked, there was only emptiness, stretching behind him like a yawning void. He finally reached a sign that read, "Welcome to Hollowbrook." But there was something odd about the sign. Its paint was peeling and the words seemed smudged, as if it had been scratched out and rewritten. It didn't seem welcoming at all. In fact, the more he stared at the sign, the more he realized it was like the town itself had been erased from history. Hollowbrook wasn't supposed to exist, at least not on any map he'd ever seen. Ethan's hands tightened on the wheel as he drove deeper into the town, the road narrowing, the trees growing, ever closer, pressing in on him like a wall of green. Finally, he arrived at the center of town, where the buildings stood as eerie and lifeless as the rest of the place. The streets were empty, save for the occasional flicker of a light from a window high above. He parked outside what looked like an old manor house, the largest building in the town, with ivy climbing up its stone walls. The windows were dark, but he could almost feel eyes watching him from inside. A sense of dread hung over the place, thick and suffocating. This was the house the letter had mentioned, the one that had called to him. As he stood there, a door creaked open. Chapter 3. The house calls. An old woman appeared in the doorway, her pale face illuminated by the soft light spilling from behind her. She was tall, almost unnaturally so, and her hair was long and silvery, flowing around her shoulders in waves like a living mist. Her eyes, pale blue and watery, held an unblinking gaze, as if she had been waiting for him. "You've come," she said softly, her voice raspy like the wind through dry leaves. "We've been waiting." Ethan's throat went dry. His body wanted to turn and run, to leave this strange town and never look back. But he couldn't move. Her voice was hypnotic, pulling him closer, making him want to know more. I don't know what's going on," he stammered, his voice trembling. "I received a letter. It said I had to come." The woman smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "The house calls, dear, and it always calls for those who belong." Ethan's mind raced. Belong? He didn't belong here. He didn't even... know these people, but there was something about her words that unsettled him, tugging at memories buried deep within. "Come inside," she urged, stepping back and holding the door open. "There is much to explain. You must learn." He hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to leave, but the same force that had driven him here now pushed him forward. His legs carried him across the threshold, and the door closed behind him with a soft, final click. The moment the door shut, the house seemed to come alive around him. The air was thick with the scent of something ancient, something decaying. The silence was profound, almost oppressive, as though the house itself was holding its breath. As he followed the old woman deeper into the mansion, the walls seemed to close in. Strange portraits adorned the walls, their faces twisted in grimaces, their eyes seeming to follow him. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and the air grew colder with each step, as if the house had not been disturbed in centuries. "I am Mrs. Hale," the woman said, her voice echoing slightly as they walked down the hallway. "And you are not the first to come here. This house has a history, one that stretches back long before your arrival." Ethan looked at her, confusion written all over his face. "A history? I don't—" "You will remember soon enough," she interrupted, her voice hardening. "But for now you must sleep. Tomorrow you will learn the truth." Chapter 4. The first night Ethan was led through a labyrinth of narrow, dimly lit hallways, the walls adorned with faded tapestries and crooked mirrors. The air was thick with the scent of must and mildew, and every corner seemed to hold something just out of sight. His senses were on high alert, and yet there was something oddly soothing about the silence, as though the house itself was a living thing breathing in time with him. Mrs. Hale stopped at a door at the end of the hall. The door was old, with ornate carvings etched into the wood, designs that twisted and coiled like vines. She opened the door with a creak, revealing a room that looked like it had been frozen in time. The furniture was antique, the bed a massive four-poster with heavy curtains drawn shut. A small fireplace crackled softly, casting flickering shadows across the room. But what caught Ethan's attention the most was the enormous mirror on the far wall, its surface dusty and clouded. The mirror seemed to pull at him, its darkened surface reflecting a distorted version of the room. "This will be your room for the night," Mrs. Hale said softly. "You may rest here. The others will be waiting for you in the morning." "Others?" Ethan asked, his curiosity piqued, but before she could answer, a soft voice echoed down the hall. Another old woman, this one slightly younger, with sharp eyes and a hurried step. She was dressed in a tattered gown and had a thin, disconcerting smile that never quite reached her eyes. Mrs. Hale nodded toward her and whispered something Ethan couldn't quite catch. "Sleep now, dear," Mrs. Hale said, her voice like gravel. "We'll talk more tomorrow." Ethan didn't have the energy to protest. He stepped into the room, his feet dragging, and without another word, Mrs. Hale closed the door behind him. The room felt oppressive, as though it was closing in on him. He sat on the bed, trying to calm his nerves, but there was something off, something wrong about this place. He tried to shake the feeling, but it lingered, like a shadow that refused to leave. He walked over to the mirror, wiping a layer of dust away with his sleeve. As his reflection cleared, he froze. The face staring back at him was not his own. For a split second, he saw a man, a stranger with pale skin and hollowed eyes. Ethan stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. But when he looked again, his own face was there, staring back at him, confused and terrified. "What the hell?" he whispered, his voice trembling. The room was silent again, but this time the air felt different, charged with a strange energy. He turned quickly, pacing to try to shake off the unease. He tried to lay on the bed, but sleep wouldn't come. The sound of footsteps echoed faintly from the hallway, distant but deliberate. Suddenly, a soft tapping on his door broke the silence. Chapter 5. The other residents, Ethan slowly got up, his heart pounding. The door creaked open slightly and a voice called out, soft and unsettling, "Mr. Carter, may we come in?" It was the voice of a man, young yet aged by something Ethan couldn't quite place. He hesitated but finally opened the door. Standing in the hallway was a figure cloaked in shadow, a tall, thin man, his features obscured by the dim light. "Who are you?" Ethan asked, his voice steady despite the growing sense of dread. "Fate." The man smiled, a smile that stretched unnaturally wide across his face. It was a grin that seemed almost too eager for a place like this. "We are the residents of Hollowbrook," the man replied, his voice smooth and hypnotic. "We are always here waiting, and we've been waiting for you." Before Ethan could respond, the man stepped forward into the room. His presence seemed to fill the space like a cold wind sweeping in. As he entered, the shadows around him seemed to shift, swirling and thickening. His eyes, pale, almost translucent, locked. On to Ethan's. "I see you've met Mrs. Hale," the man continued, his voice almost melodic. "She tends to the new arrivals, but we are the ones who've been here the longest. We know the house better than anyone." "What is this place?" Ethan demanded, his anxiety rising. "What do you want with me?" The man tilted his head as if pondering the question, his smile widening ever so slightly. "You'll learn soon enough. You'll remember it all." The room seemed to grow colder, and Ethan felt a shiver run through his spine. There was something about this man. His presence felt ancient, as if he was older than time itself. "You don't belong to the world outside anymore," the man continued, his voice taking on a dark, almost reverent tone. "You belong here. You belong to Hollowbrook." Ethan stumbled back, shaking his head, trying to escape the grip the man's words had on him. He wanted to run, to leave this house behind and never look back, but it was as though the air itself held him captive. Before Ethan could speak again, the man turned and vanished into the shadows of the hallway, his presence fading as quickly as it had arrived. The door slammed shut behind him. Ethan stood alone in the room, his mind racing. What the hell was happening? What had he gotten himself into? He paced the room, trying to make sense of everything. The walls seemed to close in on him, the shadows growing longer with each passing second. As his thoughts raced, a soft sound reached his ears, a whisper, just barely audible, as if it was coming from the walls themselves. "Ethan?" He froze, his heart leaping into his throat. The whisper came again, louder this time and unmistakably familiar. "Ethan, don't you remember?" His head spun. He gripped his temples, trying to push the voices away, but the whispers only grew louder, more insistent. "You belong here." Ethan fell to his knees, clutching his head as the whispers overwhelmed him, suffocating him in their relentless call. Suddenly, the door to the room burst open. Mrs. Hale stood there, her expression unreadable. Without a word, she moved toward him, her hands outstretched as if to guide him. "Come now," she said softly. "It's time for you to remember." Chapter 6. The truth beneath the surface, Ethan's heart. Raced in his chest as Mrs. Hale approached, her footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the silence. The whispers in his head had stopped, leaving only a dull ringing in his ears. He wanted to scream, to run, but his legs felt weak, as if they had turned to stone. The air was thick, suffocating, and the walls of the room seemed to pulse with an unseen energy. Mrs. Hale's pale eyes locked onto his, and there was a peculiar softness to her expression now. Her lips parted as if to speak, but instead of words, a faint hum escaped her. The sound vibrated in the air, unsettling yet oddly melodic. It reverberated deep inside Ethan's chest, stirring something ancient and forgotten. "You have already begun to remember, haven't you?" she asked, her voice far gentler than it had been before. "The house is calling you. The memories are waking, Ethan. It's all coming back." "No," he managed, his voice hoarse. "I don't remember. I don't know what you're talking about." Mrs. Hale gave him a soft smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, but you will. In time you will. The house holds all the answers. All the things you've forgotten. All the things you've buried." She moved closer, and despite himself, Ethan took a step back. Her gaze never left him, her smile never wavering. "You've been here before, Ethan," she continued. "You've lived here, in this house. Hollowbrook has claimed you. You are one of us." Ethan shook his head frantically, trying to make sense of it all. This can't be real. I've never been here before. I've never even heard of Hollowbrook." Mrs. Hale's expression softened further, as though she understood his confusion. "You don't remember the first time you arrived, but that doesn't mean it wasn't real. The house has a way of reshaping the past. It erases what it needs to." Before Ethan could respond, a sudden weight pressed down on him, an overwhelming pressure that made him gasp for breath. He staggered backward, his vision blurring. Mrs. Hale reached out, steadying him with surprising strength. "You don't understand yet, but you will. The house chooses its own, and it has chosen you." His knees buckled beneath him, and he sank to the floor, disoriented. The room spun, and for a moment he thought he saw shadows flitting around the edges of his vision. He blinked hard, trying to clear his mind. But when he opened his eyes, he saw something, or rather someone, in the mirror. Ethan recoiled, but the reflection did not move, its grin growing wider, more menacing. "What is this?" Ethan gasped, scrambling to his feet. Mrs. Hale's gaze followed his, and for a brief moment her face flickered with something like pity. "The house will show you what you need to see, Ethan, and in time you'll understand. You were never meant to leave. You belong to Hollowbrook now." A soft, distant sound interrupted their conversation, an eerie, melodic chime, as though a distant bell were ringing. Mrs. Hale turned her head toward the sound, her face hardening. "They're waiting for you," she said quietly before gesturing toward the door. "It's time." Chapter 7. The gathering Ethan stood frozen for a moment, still trying to shake off the terror that gripped him. His mind raced with questions he couldn't answer, but one thought echoed above all else. "I have to get out of here." Mrs. Hale did not wait for him to gather his wits. She moved swiftly to the door and opened it. Beyond it, the hallway seemed to stretch longer than before, darker and more oppressive. Ethan didn't want to move, but something, some force, was pulling him forward. "Come," Mrs. Hale urged softly. "It's time to meet the others." Reluctantly, Ethan stepped into the hall. The floorboards creaked beneath him, their noise unnervingly loud in the silence. As they walked, the air grew colder, the shadows deeper, and the house seemed to hum with an energy that made his skin crawl. The walls were now adorned with strange symbols, arcane sigils he didn't recognize, their meanings as elusive as the whispers that still clung to his mind. They walked past rooms filled with strange, distorted paintings, each one more unsettling than the last. Faces that seemed to move when you weren't looking directly at them, eyes that followed his every step. The hallway eventually opened into a grand hall, a vast circular room with a towering ceiling that seemed to disappear into darkness. At the center of the room was a large table, its surface covered with old books, candles, and something else. Something that Ethan couldn't quite make out. The table was surrounded by figures, silent, motionless, and cloaked in shadow. As Mrs. Hale led him forward, the figures stirred, their heads turning in unison to face him. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. Their faces were shrouded in darkness, but their eyes, glowing faintly, almost imperceptibly, watched him intently. "They have all been waiting for you, Ethan," Mrs. Hale said. "They are the ones who have called you back to Hollowbrook. You are one of us now." As he approached the table, a voice, soft yet commanding, came from the darkness. "You've returned," it said, the words carrying a weight that made Ethan's knees tremble. "Just as you always do." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. His mind screamed that this couldn't be happening, that this was some twisted nightmare he would wake from any moment. But the figures before him remained unmoving, and the room seemed to pulse with an eerie, malevolent energy. Who are you?" Ethan managed to choke out, his voice barely a whisper. "We are the residents of Hollowbrook," the voice replied, this time with a hint of amusement. "And we are the keepers of the house. We guide those who are called, and we welcome them home." Suddenly the air in the room grew thick, heavy, as though the very walls were closing in. Ethan could feel it now, the unmistakable sensation that he was no longer in control, that he was being drawn into something much darker than he had ever imagined. Before he could react, a sharp pain shot through his chest. He gasped, clutching at his heart as his vision blurred. The whispers came again, louder now, more urgent. "You belong here." Ethan's knees buckled and he fell to the floor. His body felt heavy, like the weight of the entire house was pressing down on him. He could feel his consciousness slipping away, his thoughts becoming muddled. He was no longer sure what was real and what was not. The last thing he heard before darkness consumed him was the voice of the man from earlier, the one who had greeted him in the hallway. "Welcome home, Ethan." Chapter 8. Beneath the veil, Ethan awoke with a jolt, his eyes snapping open to a disorienting blur of shadows and dim light. His head was spinning, his body feeling heavy and unresponsive. It took him several moments to realize he was no longer in the room where Mrs. Hale had left him. He was lying on a cold stone floor, his limbs stiff and aching. His mind raced to piece together what had just happened. The strange table, the cloaked figures, the pain, the suffocating sense that something had shifted inside him, something that wasn't quite right. He pushed himself up, the world tilting beneath him, his heart still pounding erratically. He was in a different part of the house now, a vast chamber with high, arched ceilings, adorned with more of those unsettling symbols. The walls were covered in faded tapestries, their colors indistinguishable from the dark shadows that draped them. The air felt dense, heavy with the scent of old incense, and something faintly metallic, like rust. His breath came out in quick, shallow bursts as he slowly pushed himself to his feet. A faint whisper floated through the room, soft as a breath, but clear as day. "Ethan." His heart skipped a beat. It was the same voice, the same strange whisper that had haunted his mind since he first arrived in Hollowbrook. He turned, searching the room, but saw nothing. "Ethan, you know why you're here." His skin prickled. There was something undeniably wrong about the sound of that voice. Not just the whisper itself, but the way it seemed to know him, to speak to a part of his soul that had been buried, forgotten. Without thinking, Ethan stumbled toward the door that led out of the chamber. His feet were unsteady beneath him, but something urged him on, an invisible force pulling him forward. When he opened the door, he found himself in a narrow corridor, its walls lined with more mirrors, all cracked and dusty. The reflections within them twisted and distorted, like fractured pieces of a broken truth. He tried to steady his breath as he walked, his eyes darting to each mirror he passed. His reflection was never the same, sometimes showing him as he was, sometimes as an older, hollow-eyed version of himself. Once he thought he saw something lurking behind him, a shadow, tall and unrecognizable. But when he turned around, the hallway was empty. His footsteps echoed eerily in the silence, and the sense of being watched pressed down on him, suffocating him. He felt like the walls were closing in, like the house was alive, like it had been waiting for him all along. As he turned the corner, he saw a figure standing at the end of the hallway. His heart lurched in his chest. It was Mrs. Hale, but something was different about her. Her hair, once silvery and soft, was now wild, unkempt, and streaked with gray. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, her skin ashen like she hadn't slept in days. She was staring at him with an intensity that felt otherworldly. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice hoarse, as if she had been calling him for a long time. "You've been chosen. The house has chosen you." "Chosen?" he echoed, his voice trembling with disbelief. "For what? What do you want from me?" Mrs. Hale's lips twitched into a smile that made his blood run cold. "The house wants you to remember, Ethan. It wants you to remember who you are." Ethan's stomach twisted. He stepped back, shaking his head. "No, I don't understand. I've never been here before. I don't know you. I don't know anything about this place." "The house calls," she murmured, her voice distant, like she was speaking to herself. "The house calls to those it owns. And when it calls, there's no escaping it. You were brought here for a reason, to complete the circle, to join us." "Join you?" His throat was dry. "Who are you people?" Her eyes met his, and for the first time there was something like sympathy in them. "We are the residents, the souls who were lost to the house, long ago. We have been waiting, Ethan, waiting for you to return." "Return?" Ethan repeated, his mind spinning. "I've never been here. I don't even know who you are." Her gaze softened, and she took a slow step toward him. The house has a way of erasing memories, but it can never take away what is truly yours. You were born here, Ethan. You lived here, your family lived here. Family? The word sent a jolt of recognition through his body. A faint memory stirred within him, but it was blurry, fragmented. I don't have any family. You did? Mrs. Hale interrupted, her voice now a whisper laced with an unsettling urgency. Your mother, your father, they lived here before you, before they were taken by the house. Ethan's heart pounded as her words sank in. He tried to piece together the fractured memories, but they came in flashes, snippets of faces, of voices, but they were blurred and indistinct, like trying to hold on to smoke. I don't remember, Ethan whispered, his voice shaking. I don't remember them. I don't remember this place. Mrs. Hale's smile faded. She reached out, her hand cold and trembling, and touched his arm. You will, she said softly. The house will make you remember. Chapter 9. The Forgotten Ones, Mrs. Hale led Ethan down the darkened corridor, the silence around them almost unbearable. The atmosphere seemed to press in on him from all sides, the air heavy with a sense of anticipation. He could hear the faint hum of something deeper, something ancient pulsing beneath the house like a heart beating in the walls. Every step he took felt like he was descending deeper into something he couldn't escape. At the end of the hall, another door stood. This one was heavy, ancient-looking, covered in strange runes that seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light. Mrs. Hale placed her hand on the door, her eyes flickering with something that could almost be described as fear. She hesitated for a moment before opening it. Beyond the door, the room was vast. It felt like a vast underground chamber lit by an eerie, flickering light that seemed to come from nowhere. The air was thick with the scent of decay, like something long forgotten. The floor was covered in dust except for strange footprints that led in all directions, as if something or someone had been here recently. As they stepped inside, Ethan's gaze was drawn to a figure in the center of the room. A man hunched over, his back to them. The man's skin was pale, almost translucent, his clothes tattered and ragged. His hair was wild, and he was muttering to himself in a language Ethan couldn't understand. Who is that? Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper. That, Mrs. Hale replied softly, is your father. Chapter 10. The father's secret. Ethan's heart nearly stopped when Mrs. Hale spoke those words. Your father. The man before him looked nothing like the father he had no memories of. This pale, gaunt figure seemed more like a shadow of a person, a hollow shell of someone who had once lived and breathed. His body was bent, almost as if it had been twisted by some unseen force, and the muttering, low and indecipherable, only added to the unnerving air in the room. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he took a cautious step forward. Mrs. Hale was standing quietly behind him, her eyes flicking to the man and then back to Ethan as if waiting for something, but not saying a word. The man's muttering continued like a soft chant, rhythmic and disturbing. Ethan could make out a few words. Hollowbrook, chosen, return, but they made no sense. Each syllable seemed to twist in the air, sinking into his skin, like the very atmosphere was warping with their meaning. The silence stretched on, and Ethan found himself drawn to the man, despite the overwhelming dread gnawing at his chest. Slowly his feet carried him forward, his hands trembling at his sides. As he got closer, he noticed the man's hands were clasped together tightly in front of him, as if in prayer. The skin of his hands was paper thin, revealing veins that looked like they could burst at any moment. Father, Ethan whispered, his voice trembling. The word felt foreign on his tongue, like he had never said it before. His mind screamed for answers, answers he wasn't sure he wanted anymore. The man stopped muttering abruptly. His head lifted slightly, and his face, oh, that face, was something Ethan barely recognized. His father's features were sharp, gaunt, and hollow, the eyes wide but vacant, as if they had seen too much. And yet, despite the decay, there was a familiarity in those eyes, something that tugged at the very core of Ethan's being. Ethan. The voice that came from the man was a rasp, barely audible, like a memory pulled from the depths of something long buried. You've returned, haven't you? Ethan took a cautious step forward, his throat dry. He wanted to run, to escape this place, but something anchored him to the spot, like the weight of his own blood held him in place. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. "Father, what happened to you?" Ethan finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. The man's lips twisted into a faint, almost pitying smile. "What happened?" "Oh, Ethan, you don't know the half of it." He slowly straightened, his movements stiff, as if his bones had forgotten how to move properly. Ethan recoiled slightly, but forced himself to stay in front of the man. His father's eyes locked onto his, and, for a brief moment, there was a flicker of recognition, but then it was gone, replaced by something darker. "The house," the man continued, his voice trembling. "It calls, it pulls us all back. Those who belong here, those who have always belonged here." "What are you talking about?" Ethan demanded, his hands clenched into fists. "I don't remember any of this. I don't even remember you." The man's eyes softened, but his smile didn't waver. "You will. It will all come back, son. The house has a way of making you remember. It takes what it needs, but it always gives back more than it takes, more than you can ever forget." Ethan's breath caught in his throat as a sudden, horrifying realization began to take root. "You," he gasped, his mind racing. "You're not alive, are you? You're dead. You died." The man's lips curled into a cruel smile. "Dead? No, Ethan, no, we never truly die here, not in Hollowbrook, not if the house has any say in it." His father's voice dropped to a whisper, and the words that followed made Ethan's skin crawl. "It keeps us alive in a way you can't imagine, in a way we can't escape, not until it has what it wants from us." Ethan took a step back, fear gripping his heart. "What does it want?" Mrs. Hale finally spoke, her voice a soft, almost reverent murmur. "It wants you. The house wants you to remember what it's taken. It wants you to become a part of it. To complete the circle?" "Complete the circle?" Ethan repeated, his voice growing hoarse. "What circle? What are you talking about?" His father's hands tightened in front of him, the paper-thin skin stretching over the bones, as if the effort of holding them together was too much. "The house, it takes souls, Ethan. Generations of souls. And in return, it keeps them. It keeps them trapped, in exchange for the promise of something more, something eternal." The words sank into Ethan's mind like a weight pressing him down. His eyes darted around the chamber, seeking some explanation, some way to break free from the grip of the house. But the walls seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, and the flickering lights cast shifting shadows that whispered promises of things Ethan was terrified to understand. You were chosen," Mrs. Hale said, stepping forward, her voice like a caress. "Just like we all were, just like your father was, and just like your ancestors before him. Hollowbrook claims you, Ethan. You can't fight it. You can't escape it." "No," Ethan breathed, shaking his head. "No, this can't be true. It can't be." "It is," his father said softly, his voice almost sad. "And it always will be." Ethan staggered back, his heart thudding. In his chest, his mind reeling. This couldn't be happening, this couldn't be his fate. He wasn't like them, he wasn't one of the residents. But as he looked at his father's hollowed face, and then at Mrs. Hale, whose smile never wavered, it began to dawn on him. Hollowbrook wasn't just a house. It was a living thing, a force that fed off of those who entered. It didn't just trap them, it reshaped them, remade them in its own twisted image. And now, it wanted him. The whispers started again, louder, this time rising like a choir inside his skull. "Ethan, come home. You are one of us. You cannot escape." He staggered as if the house itself was tugging at him, pulling him into its embrace. But he knew there was no escaping now. No way. Out. Hollowbrook had claimed him, and with that thought a chill ran down his spine as his father's voice echoed in his ears. "You are home." Chapter 11. The Awakening. The room seemed to close in on Ethan, the walls pressing tighter with every passing second. His breath came in short, shallow gasps as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. He could feel the house's heartbeat. Beneath his feet, like the very ground was alive and pulsing with a dark energy, that he could neither comprehend nor escape. His father's figure remained unmoving in the center of the room, his eyes never leaving Ethan, never blinking as if waiting for something. Mrs. Hale stood silently beside him, her face as impassive as ever, but there was something in her eyes, a glimmer of pity perhaps, or resignation, as if she too had once fought against the pull of the house and failed. The air felt thick with expectation, as though the house was waiting for Ethan to make a choice. Why me? Ethan's voice broke the silence, raw and desperate. Why? Am I the one? Why is Hollowbrook choosing me? Mrs. Hale's expression softened almost sadly. Because you belong here, Ethan. Just as your father and your ancestors before him. The house doesn't make mistakes. It never calls someone who doesn't already have a place in its heart. But I don't remember any of this. I don't remember you or my father, or this place. Ethan's voice rose with panic. How can you say I belong here when I don't even know what this place is? It's not about what you remember, she whispered. It's about what's inside you. The house can take everything else, but it cannot take who you are. It never can, and it knows. It knew from the very beginning. You are part of it, just like your father before you. Just like the others who came before. Ethan's mind was spinning. He turned his gaze back to his father, whose eyes were now wide with something between longing and sorrow. His father raised a trembling hand toward him. Ethan, you can't. Fight it, you never could, his father rasped, his voice barely audible. The house chose you for a reason. You will see. When you remember, you will understand. Remember what? Ethan demanded, his body trembling. What is there to remember? I don't know any of you, I don't know this house, and I don't want to belong here. His father's hollow eyes glimmered with a strange understanding. You think you have a choice? You think you can leave? A cold chill shot through Ethan's chest, as though the very air in the room had turned to ice. His heart pounded faster, louder, like the sound of a drumbeat echoing in his head. Before he could respond, the ground beneath him trembled, sending a wave of disorienting motion through the room. The floorboards creaked, and the walls groaned with the weight of the house's unseen power. Ethan's legs buckled, and he dropped, to his knees, clutching at his chest as the room spun around him. A low, vibrating hum filled the air, emanating from the house itself, as though it were alive, breathing and watching. The whispers became a chorus, a cacophony of voices all chanting his name. Ethan's head throbbed as memories, fragments, fleeting, began to surface. Faces of people he'd never known, places that were impossibly familiar but out of reach. He could almost hear them now, the faint whispers of his ancestors, their voices calling him back. Ethan, you must remember. He gasped, his hands clutching his head as the memories started to push through, like shards of broken glass piercing his mind. You were born here. This is where you belong. No! Ethan cried out, his voice raw, desperate. I don't want this. I don't want to be a part of this. But his words fell on deaf ears. The house had already begun its work, unraveling the threads of his mind. His father's words echoed in his head like a relentless drumbeat, filling every corner of his thoughts. You belong here, the voice whispered. You always have. Suddenly Ethan felt the pull, an invisible force tugging him forward, pulling him deeper into the house's grasp. His body moved of its own accord, his limbs heavy, unresponsive. It was as though the house was forcing him to walk, forcing him to follow the path it had laid out for him long ago. His father's voice rang in his ears, low and broken. It's time, Ethan. The circle is almost complete. Ethan's vision blurred, and his surroundings began to shift, fading in and out. He saw the hallway stretch out before him, distorted and unrecognizable, like some twisted version of reality. The once familiar house now seemed like a living thing, breathing, shifting, warping. The walls pulsed as if they had a heartbeat, the air thick with the scent of decay and forgotten memories. He stumbled, but his feet kept moving, as though the house itself were guiding him. And then, through the haze of confusion and terror, he saw it. At the end of the hallway, standing in a doorway, was a figure cloaked in shadow, its face hidden but its presence unmistakable. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the figure stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. It was tall, impossibly so, and its movements were unnervingly fluid, as though it wasn't entirely bound by the laws of reality. The figure raised a hand, pointing at him. A deep, guttural voice rumbled from the darkness, a voice that seemed to come from the very depths of the house. "You are ready." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, the blood rushing in his ears. His limbs felt weak, and the ground beneath him seemed to shift, as though it were swallowing him whole. Panic set in, but he couldn't move. The house had him in its grip, and there was no escape. His eyes darted around, desperately searching for a way out, but the figure only advanced, its shadow stretching longer with each step it took. As it neared, its features became clearer, and Ethan could see, despite the overwhelming darkness, that its face was his own. He stumbled back, his mind reeling in terror. This isn't possible. This isn't real. But the figure before him smiled, an impossibly wide, cruel smile, and its eyes flickered with a cold, predatory gleam. "You've always been here," the figure said, its voice echoing in Ethan's mind, filling every corner of his being. "And now, you will never leave." Chapter 12. The choice Ethan's heart raced, his entire body trembling in fear as the figure himself stepped closer, its dark, hollow eyes never leaving his. His mind screamed in protest, but the house's grip on him tightened, suffocating him. He could feel the weight of something ancient and terrible pressing down on him, like 1,000 hands reaching from the walls, pulling him toward the abyss. He backed away, stumbling, but there was nowhere to go. The figure followed him, its smile widening with each step, and the whispers from the house grew louder, drowning out his thoughts. The house was closing in, surrounding him, trapping him in its labyrinthine corridors, each twist and turn leading him deeper into its grasp. "You can't escape, Ethan," the figure said, its voice like a cold wind sweeping through the room. "You are Hollowbrook, and Hollowbrook is you." He shook his head violently, trying to break free from the terrible vision before him. But the figure was all he could see now, its dark presence filling every corner of the room, suffocating him. "Why?" Ethan gasped, his voice hoarse with panic. "Why me? What do you want from me?" The figure paused, its eyes glimmering with something darker than shadow. "You are the final piece," it said. "The house has taken so much already, but it needs one last thing to complete the circle. You are the key, Ethan, you always have been." Chapter 13. The circle Ethan's mind was a blur of fear and confusion. The figure that stood before him was himself, yet not. There was something wrong, something hollow about its presence, its voice, its very being. And as the figure took another step closer, Ethan's heart felt like it might explode from the sheer terror flooding his veins. You're not me," Ethan whispered, though the words seemed weak even to his own ears. "You can't be." The figure's smile widened, its eyes glowing with a faint, sickly light. "I am you, Ethan. Everything you are, everything you've forgotten, it's all inside me. It's always been inside you." The figure's voice was a dark echo of his own, but there was no warmth to it, only a cold emptiness. The house, it doesn't just take lives, it takes souls, and it keeps them. Forever. Ethan's body trembled with a growing sense of helplessness. The figure was right, in a way. He did feel the connection. He could feel the weight of the house pressing down on him, the whispers reaching deeper into his soul with each passing second. His own blood seemed to churn in his veins, as if it was responding to the figure's words, the figure that now seemed to bleed into the very fabric of the house itself. "No, this isn't happening," Ethan said, his voice cracking. I'm not like you. I'm not like any of you." The figure tilted its head, its gaze turning almost sympathetic, though there was nothing kind in it. "You were never supposed to escape, Ethan. The house has kept us all trapped for so long, but it never forces you to stay. You always have a choice. You just don't remember." Choice. Ethan felt a wave of disgust rise in him, his stomach twisting. "I never asked for any of this. I didn't choose this." The figure's expression hardened, its smile replaced by something more sinister. "You didn't choose, but you were. Always destined to be here. The house chooses those it calls. You were born into it just like your father, and your father's father before him. Ethan recoiled, but the figure's presence was suffocating, pulling him into its orbit, dragging him further into the house's terrible embrace. He couldn't escape it, no matter how hard he tried. His legs were heavy, his limbs stiff, his chest tight as though the house was reaching into him, tearing at his very essence. The figure stepped forward, towering over him, its face a twisted mirror of his own. "It's your turn, Ethan. It's time for you to remember." Suddenly, a violent surge of images rushed through his mind. Blurs of faces, fleeting memories, things he could barely understand. His mother's face, a fleeting glimpse of her holding him as a child. His father, much younger, smiling before. The darkness had consumed him. But there was something more, a darker presence, something that lingered just out of reach, hidden beneath the surface of these memories. The figure's voice cut through the flood of images. "You know what the house wants. It needs your soul, Ethan. It's always been your soul that it desires. It's the final piece that will complete the circle, the key to unlocking everything. Everything you see here, everything you've forgotten. It's all tied to you. You can't fight it. You never could." Ethan's breath came in sharp gasps. His body was trembling, caught between fear and something else, something darker, something inside him that he couldn't explain. The house was alive, and it had been alive long before he had ever set foot in Hollowbrook. It had watched. It had waited, and now it was calling him to fulfill his part in its eternal cycle. His father's voice echoed in his mind. "The circle must be completed, Ethan. You are the last to return. You will not escape." The house seemed to hum with power, the walls trembling as though the very structure itself was awakening, eager to claim its prize. Ethan's skin prickled, and for the first time since he'd arrived, he felt a surge of clarity, an understanding that he had been slowly building toward all this time. He wasn't just a visitor in Hollowbrook. He had been chosen. He had always been chosen. The whispers returned, louder now, thrumming in the air like the distant roar of an unseen storm. "Ethan, come home. Come to us." "No," Ethan whispered, his voice trembling, but his resolve beginning to form like the first spark of fire in the heart of the dark. "I won't let you take me." The figure laughed, a low, mocking sound that echoed through the room, reverberating in Ethan's chest. "You think you have a choice? You think you can defy the house? It's already inside you, Ethan, the memories, the blood, the legacy. The house owns you." Ethan's chest tightened, his heartbeat a frantic drum in his ears. The figure's words cut deep, like nails on the edge of his mind. But something inside him flared, a small, flickering light that refused to be extinguished. The house might have claimed his ancestors, might have turned them into something else, something trapped. But Ethan was not like them. He had nothing to lose anymore, no memories to cling to, no family to protect. The house had already taken those things, but it hadn't taken his will. "No," he said again, his voice firmer now. "I won't let you win." The figure paused. For a moment, Ethan thought he saw something like surprise in its eyes. "You think you can resist?" the figure hissed. "The house is part of you. You are the house. You can't escape what you are." Ethan's hand shot out, and for the first time he felt a strange power surging through his fingers. The air crackled with energy, as his body was suddenly flooded with strength. A strength that wasn't his own, but felt like it was born from the very heart of Hollowbrook. With a sharp cry, he slammed his hand into the figure's chest. The figure screamed, a terrible, distorted sound like the cries of 1,000 souls trapped in agony, and staggered back, its form flickering as if it were being consumed by darkness. Ethan's pulse hammered in his ears, but he didn't stop. He pressed forward, his voice rising in defiance. "I will never be a part of this." The ground beneath him shook, and for a moment, the house seemed to tremble in response, as if it was reacting to Ethan's defiance. The walls groaned and cracked, and the faint light flickered erratically, like a candle about to snuff out. The figure screeched once more, but its form was beginning to unravel. "You can't stop it. You're a part of it. You're the final piece." "No," Ethan growled, his voice steady with newfound resolve. I'm not like you. I am not Hollowbrook." With every ounce of strength he had, Ethan shoved the figure back, and with a final deafening crack, the house screamed. The walls buckled, the shadows recoiled, and the figure, the twisted, warped version of himself, disintegrated into nothing but a cloud of smoke and dust. For a moment, everything was still. The whispers died down. The heavy air cleared. The house seemed to fall silent, as if it had been stunned, as if it were waiting. Ethan stood alone in the center of the hallway, breathing hard, his chest rising and falling with the effort. The house, Hollowbrook, was still there, but it no longer felt like a prison. It no longer felt like it had ownership of him. He was free. But was he truly? Chapter 14. The heart of Hollowbrook. Ethan stood at the center of the corridor, the silence around him almost deafening. The last echo of the figure's scream reverberated in the air, and yet the house, that oppressive, malignant presence, felt less suffocating, almost empty. For a moment, Ethan allowed himself to breathe, his chest heaving with the realization that he had somehow won. He had destroyed that twisted version of himself, the part of him that Hollowbrook had created to claim his soul, but a nagging voice in the back of his mind whispered that this was not over, that nothing could be over in Hollowbrook until it had claimed every last piece of what it wanted. As Ethan steadied himself, his eyes flitted nervously to the surrounding walls. The house felt different now, less alive. The pulsing, throbbing energy he had felt earlier was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness, a sort of fragile calm. He knew the house wasn't dead. It was merely waiting, like a predator pausing before the final strike. He began to move, his footsteps echoing hollowly, in the grand hallway. The farther he walked, the colder the air grew, and the deeper the sense of wrongness gnawed at him. The walls around him seemed to close in, not as if they were physically pressing, but as if the house were drawing its attention to him, watching, waiting for his next move. But what could he do? He had already defied the house, resisted its grip. And yet, as he turned another corner, a cold dread crept over him, like the house was pulling him back into its embrace. His blood ran cold, and his skin prickled with the distinct feeling that the house had not given up on him. It never did. In the distance, he saw a flicker of light, a pale glow seeping from a door slightly ajar. His heart beat faster. The source of the light seemed to hum in his bones, like the whisper of the house calling him back, urging him forward. He walked toward it, slowly, cautiously. As he approached the door, he could hear faint sounds, a murmur, like whispers that somehow felt familiar. The closer he got, the clearer the voices became. "Ethan, Ethan, please." The words seemed to echo from deep within the very walls of Hollowbrook, each syllable coating his skin with cold. They were not the whispers of the house, but something else, something personal. He reached for the door handle, his hand trembling. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, but the pull was undeniable, compelling him, urging him to understand. He pushed the door open. Chapter 15. The heart of the house. The walls around Ethan cracked and splintered, the very foundation of the house shuddering under the force of his defiance. The house, once so alive with dark energy, began to groan, its pulse slowing, its walls shaking as though it were in pain. The power that had once fed on him now recoiled in fear. "No," the figure hissed, its form splintering further. "No, you can't fight this. You can't fight me." But Ethan didn't stop. He stepped forward, his body blazing with strength. His mind focused only on the destruction of the house, on ending the endless cycle. The house had taken so much. It had taken his family, it had taken his memories, but it would take no more. With a final, primal scream, Ethan thrust his hands out toward the figure, and the air crackled with energy. The figure screeched, disintegrating, into 1,000 shards of glass that scattered across the room. The walls cracked. The floors buckled. The house was dying, and Ethan was free. Chapter 17. The aftermath. The silence was deafening. Ethan stood amidst the ruins of the once immense, oppressive house, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The air around him was thick with the remnants of shattered glass, the walls groaning in agony as if they were slowly crumbling into nothing. Hollowbrook, this cursed ancient place that had consumed so much, was finally falling apart. And with it, the weight that had held Ethan for so long was beginning to lift, yet something felt wrong. Though the house was weakening, the shadows lingered. The faint whispers, those insistent, hungry voices, still crawled at the edges of his mind, slipping beneath the cracks of his resolve. The air still had a damp, cold chill, and the weight of it seemed to press down on him like the aftermath of a storm. Ethan rubbed his forehead, his body aching as though he had just fought a battle, his limbs heavy, exhausted. But his heart was still racing. His pulse thrummed in his ears, and with every breath, the remnants of Hollowbrook's malevolent power tugged at his soul, reminding him of its presence. He moved toward the center of the room, his eyes scanning the debris, the shattered remnants of the mirror, the crumbling walls, the dark emptiness where once the house had stood so solid, so suffocating. The feeling of dread was slowly starting to ebb, but deep down, Ethan knew it wasn't over. The house was dying, but its spirit, its curse, was still alive. That's when he saw it. Near the back of the room, half hidden beneath a pile of crumbled stone and splintered wood, was an old, ornate chest. Its surface was cracked, worn, but there was something about it, a strange pull, a whisper deep within that drew him to it. It was almost as if it had been waiting for him. Ethan hesitated, a chill creeping up his spine. Was it possible that this chest, this relic, was a part of the house's heart, another piece of its monstrous existence, something that even now refused to be destroyed? But something in him told him he had to know. He had to understand the source of the house's power before it was truly over. He needed to see it, to feel it. His hands trembling slightly, he reached out, brushing aside the debris. He opened the chest slowly, heart pounding. Inside there was only one thing, a book. Its cover was made of blackened leather, worn with age, its edges frayed. The pages inside were yellowed and curling with time, as though the book itself had existed for centuries. There was a strange aura around it, an energy that seemed to hum in Ethan's chest as he touched it. This wasn't just any book. This was the house's true heart. As his fingers closed around the book, the room trembled, and for the briefest of moments, he felt the house stir beneath his feet as if it was awakening. "No, not again," he muttered, stumbling back, clutching the book to his chest. His mind raced. The house couldn't be this alive. He had destroyed the heart. He had broken the mirror. The figure, the one that had been created from him, from his family, from their shared connection to the house, had been torn apart. But still, something lingered. A voice, sharp, desperate, and too familiar, whispered in his mind. "You cannot escape it, Ethan. It has always been part of you." Ethan's breath hitched. He could hear it again, the voice of the house or something else, echoing deep within his thoughts. It was the same feeling he had sensed ever since he first stepped foot into Hollowbrook, the feeling of being watched, the feeling that the house was not just alive, but alive in him. "You are Hollowbrook," the voice continued, a sickly sweetness in the words. "You cannot break free from the cycle. The blood of your ancestors runs through you, your father's blood, your grandfather's. You are a part of this house. Forever." Ethan's hands clenched around the book, his pulse quickening. He couldn't let this happen. He couldn't let the house win. Chapter 15. The Heart of the House. The room beyond the door was vast, larger than it had any right to be. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, and the air smelled stale, like the remnants of something long forgotten. At the far end of the room stood a massive, ornate mirror, its frame twisted and cracked. The reflection in the glass, however, was what held Ethan's attention. In the mirror, he saw himself, but not as he was now. He was younger, a child, standing in the very same room. His small face reflected a look of wonder, of innocence, but the shadow of a dark presence loomed behind him. The house, its dark energy, reached out from the mirror, coiling like a serpent. And then he saw it. A shadow, dark and serpentine, stretching behind the child version of himself, reaching out toward Ethan's current form. The figure in the mirror slowly turned, its eyes empty, voids that stared straight into Ethan's soul. The reflection of himself smiled, a terrible, mocking smile, and whispered, "You should have stayed." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be. And yet the reflection beckoned, pulling him in, a force stronger than any he had felt before. The room began to warp around him, the mirror growing larger, and the shadow behind his younger self seemed to stretch, threatening to consume him. "Come closer." He staggered back, the room spinning as the house's whispers roared in his ears, now louder than ever. His pulse raced in his ears, his vision blurring as the walls warped and distorted. He gripped his head, trying to shut out the terrible voices, but then, through the chaos, a single image broke through. A single terrifying truth. This room. "It's the heart of the house," Ethan gasped, and the realization hit him like a bolt of lightning. This wasn't just a room. This was the source of Hollowbrook's power, the very core of its existence. And that reflection, that twisted version of himself, that was Hollowbrook's true face, the entity that had been feeding on his family, consuming them, shaping them into the house's eternal prisoners. The mirror was no longer just a reflection. It was a doorway, a gateway between worlds, between the living and the dead. Without thinking, Ethan reached toward the mirror, his fingers trembling as they brushed the cold glass. The moment his skin touched it, the mirror shimmered, its surface rippling like water. The room around him seemed to tilt, the shadows growing darker, more oppressive. "No," Ethan shouted, pulling his hand back, but it was too late. The mirror cracked. Chapter 16. The Shattering. The room exploded with a deafening sound, like the very foundations of the house were splitting apart. Ethan stumbled, his heart hammering in his chest, as the mirror shattered into 1,000 shards, each fragment reflecting 1,000 different versions of himself. Each reflection twisted, contorted, and laughed at him, mocking him, reminding him of his failure. As the glass fell, it seemed to move, swirling in the air, slowly pulling together into shapes, into forms. From the wreckage of the mirror, a dark figure emerged. Its outline formed from the shards, its face a mass of jagged, fractured glass. Ethan's pulse raced. He backed away, his breath shallow, his feet stumbling as the figure loomed closer, its jagged edges glinting in the dim light. "You've broken it," the figure's voice came, distorted, like the sound of shattered glass being scraped across stone. "Now you've awakened everything." The figure reached out, and with it the air grew thick, thicker than before, heavier, like the weight of the house itself had increased. The walls seemed to breathe, to expand and contract with the presence of the figure, and the whispers returned louder than ever. Ethan could feel it now, feel the house's hunger deep within him. It wasn't just pulling at him, it was pulling from him. He could feel the tendrils of its power extending into his soul, reaching for the very essence of who he was. "No!" Ethan screamed, his fists clenched. "I won't let you take me!" The figure laughed again, the sound rattling through his bones. "You have no choice. It's too late, Ethan. You were always meant to complete the circle. You were always meant to belong." Ethan could feel his body tremble under the weight of the house's power, but within him, something else began to awaken. Something far older, far more powerful than he could have imagined. The fire that had sparked within him earlier flared, again stronger now, burning away the fear that had held him captive. He was more than the house's victim. He was more than just its prey, and he would not give in. "I am not you," Ethan shouted, the words coming from deep within him, empowered by a strength he didn't understand but felt coursing through him. "I will never be a part of you." The figure recoiled as if stung. "I am not you," he gritted, stepping back, forcing himself to breathe, to calm himself. "I am not Hollowbrook." The voice didn't respond, but the house seemed to grow quieter, more distant, as if it were recoiling, unsure of what to do with his defiance. For a long moment Ethan stood there, the weight of the book in his hands, the shadows around him still and silent. It was as though the house had stopped moving, as though it was waiting for him to make the next choice, and that was when he realized it. The book, this ancient, dark relic, was not just a key to Hollowbrook. It was a choice that had been passed down from generation to generation, carried by his family like a dark inheritance. His father had once made this choice. So had his grandfather. But this time, he would make the final decision. With trembling hands, Ethan opened the book. The pages rustled softly, revealing scrawled dark symbols. Symbols that seemed to move, twisting on the page as though they were alive, feeding on the fear that pulsed in the air. The words seemed to glow faintly, an unnatural light that made Ethan's stomach twist. This is how it ends, the book whispered in his mind, the words crawling across his thoughts like insects. The circle will be completed. The house will be whole again. No, Ethan whispered fiercely, clenching his jaw. Not today. He slammed the book shut. The room quaked again, but this time it was different. The shaking was not from the house's death throes. No, this was something else, something more terrible. A figure began to form in the center of the room, a shape that rose from the darkness. It was tall, its body shifting and warping as though it were being stitched together from the very shadows of the house. A face emerged. His face, twisted, jagged, broken. Hollowbrook's curse, a reflection of him, a distortion of his bloodline. You can't stop it, Ethan, the figure rasped, its voice like the grinding of old wood. You've always been part of this. You can't escape your legacy. I'm not you, Ethan roared. His hand shot out, the book clutched tightly in his grip. The house trembled again, the floor cracking beneath his feet. But Ethan held firm. The figure reached for him, its jagged fingers outstretched. But Ethan felt something stir inside him. A power, a force he hadn't known was there. The book, in his hands, began to glow brighter, its dark aura now pushing back against the figure. The figure screamed, its form warping violently, but Ethan's grip on the book never wavered. I said, he growled, I am not you, and I will never be. With a surge of energy, Ethan slammed the book into the figure. A blinding light erupted from the pages, overwhelming the house's last remnants, and for a brief moment, it seemed like the world had frozen, like the house itself had paused, as if it were holding its breath. And then, with a final, thunderous crack, the light consumed everything. Chapter 18. The dawn Ethan awoke to the quiet. It wasn't the silence of Hollowbrook's eerie stillness. It wasn't the suffocating quiet that had once pressed down on him like an invisible weight. No, this was different. This was peaceful. He opened his eyes, blinking against the pale light of dawn. His surroundings were normal. The crumbled walls, the twisted shadows, gone. In their place was a quiet, natural world. The house, Hollowbrook, was no longer there. He was standing outside now, in the middle of a lush green field, the rising sun casting a soft glow over the landscape. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Ethan took a deep breath, and the air felt clean, fresh, free. The curse was broken. Ethan looked around, his eyes misting slightly. He was free. Hollowbrook was no longer a part of him. His father, his grandfather, all of them had been lost to the house, but he had ended the cycle. The house had crumbled. Hollowbrook was gone. But as Ethan stood there taking in the peaceful surroundings, he couldn't help but wonder if something else, something deeper, had truly been freed. And then, just as the thought crossed his mind, a figure appeared in the distance, a shadow moving in the light. Would it ever be truly over? The future was uncertain. But for now, Ethan was free.